There is a quarterback who carries the football like a poet carries a pen, with a kind of effortless precision that makes the impossible look ordinary. He can throw a pass into a window no bigger than a paperback book, threading the needle between two defenders and dropping the ball exactly where only his receiver can catch it. He has a mind for the game that is almost supernatural, reading defenses before they even know what they are doing, calling audibles at the line of scrimmage that make offensive coordinators look like they are just holding a clipboard for decoration. This is the talent of Aaron Rodgers, but talent alone never made a legacy this complicated. Aaron Rodgers is one of the most gifted quarterbacks the National Football League has ever seen. Statistically, he sits at the very top of the mountain, with a career passer rating that is the highest in league history, multiple Most Valuable Player awards, and a Super Bowl ring. He is a master of the craft, someone who can throw off balance, on the run, from impossible angles and still hit his target with surgical accuracy. But his career is not just a story of touchdowns and championships. It is also a story of drama, of broken relationships, of a man who seems to exist in a state of constant tension with the world around him. There are people who love Aaron Rodgers, who see him as a misunderstood genius, a man who speaks his mind and refuses to play the game of media manipulation. And there are people who cannot stand him, who see him as selfish, arrogant, and infuriatingly aloof. The truth, as it often does, lives somewhere in the messy middle. To understand Aaron Rodgers, you have to go back to the beginning. He was born in Chico, California on December 2, 1983. His father, Ed Rodgers, was a chiropractor, and his mother, Darla, was a homemaker. The family was not wealthy, but they were solidly middle class, living in a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood. Aaron was the youngest of three boys, and he grew up in a household that valued sports and competition. His older brothers, Luke and Jordan, were both athletes, and Aaron was always trying to keep up, always trying to prove himself. He was a natural athlete, but he was not a prodigy. He was not the kind of kid who was throwing spirals at the age of 5 or being recruited by college scouts before he hit puberty. He was just a normal boy who loved football, basketball, and baseball, and who spent his afternoons throwing passes to his brothers in the backyard. What set Aaron apart, even as a child, was his mind. He was obsessive about the details of the game, always asking questions, always trying to understand the why behind the play. He would watch game film with his father, not just for fun, but to study the movements of quarterbacks, to see how they set their feet, how they read the defense, how they made decisions under pressure. He was not the biggest kid or the fastest kid, but he had an intellectual hunger that was unusual. That hunger would carry him through high school, where he became a standout quarterback at Pleasant Valley High School. He threw for over 2,400 yards and 22 touchdowns in his senior season, earning a scholarship offer from the University of California, Berkeley. But even then, the recruiting experts were not exactly beating down his door. He was a three-star prospect, ranked somewhere in the middle of the pack among high school quarterbacks in the country. No one was calling him a future Hall of Famer. No one was even sure he would start for a major college program. At Cal, Rodgers quickly proved that the scouts had underestimated him. He took over as the starting quarterback in his sophomore year and began to put up numbers that turned heads. In 2004, his junior season, he threw for 24 touchdowns and just 8 interceptions, completing over 67% of his passes. He led the Golden Bears to a 101 record and a top 10 ranking in the national polls. He was poised to be a first-round draft pick, maybe even the #1 overall pick. The NFL was watching. The San Francisco 49ers held the first pick that year, and they desperately needed a quarterback. Rodgers grew up a 49ers fan, and the thought of playing for his childhood team was a dream come true. He was convinced that San Francisco would take him. His family was convinced. The entire Bay Area was convinced. But the NFL draft is a strange beast, full of misinformation, smoke screens, and decisions that defy logic. On that April day in 2005, The 49ers shocked the football world by selecting Alex Smith, a quarterback from Utah, with the first overall pick. Rodgers sat in the green room, surrounded by cameras and family, and watched as his name was passed over again and again. He waited through the second pick, the third pick, the fourth pick. The Green Bay Packers held the 24th pick, and they had a franchise quarterback in Brett Favre who was still in his prime. They did not need a quarterback, but general manager Ted Thompson saw value that no one else seemed to see, and when the Packers selected Aaron Rodgers with the 24th overall pick, Rodgers walked onto the stage with a mixture of relief and something else, something that looked like resentment. He had fallen, and he never forgot it. That fall became a defining part of his identity. He talked about it often in interviews, about how being doubted, being overlooked, made him who he was. He used it as fuel. And for the first 3 years of his career, he sat on the bench behind Brett Favre, learning, waiting, and watching. It was a strange apprenticeship. Favre was a living legend, a gunslinger who played the game with reckless abandon. Rodgers was the opposite, a conservative, methodical quarterback who analyzed every situation before he threw the ball. The two men were never close. Favre was not interested in mentoring the rookie, and Rodgers was not interested in being a sidekick. The tension between them was palpable, but it stayed beneath the surface until the summer of 2008, when Favre announced his retirement, then unretired, then was traded to the New York Jets. The franchise was finally Rodgers, and the drama began. Rodgers took over as the starting quarterback of the Green Bay Packers in 2008, and he was immediate. He threw for over 4,000 yards in his first season, with 28 touchdowns and 13 interceptions. The team went 6-1-0, but the future looked bright. The next year, Rodgers led the Packers to a playoff berth, and in 2010, everything clicked. He threw for 39 touchdowns against 11 interceptions, posted a passer rating over 101, and led the Packers to a 1-0-6 record. In the playoffs, he was unstoppable. He threw for over 300 yards in each of the 4 games, completing nearly 70% of his passes, and he threw for 9 touchdowns against 2 interceptions. In Super Bowl XLV against the Pittsburgh Steelers, he threw for 304 yards and 3 touchdowns, and he was named the Super Bowl Most Valuable Player. He was on top of the world. That Super Bowl win should have been the start of a dynasty. The Packers had a young, talented roster, and Rodgers was playing at a level that few quarterbacks had ever reached. But the years that followed were not a smooth ride. The Packers made the playoffs year after year, but they kept coming up short. They lost in the divisional round, they lost in the conference championship, they lost in the wild card game. And with each loss, the narrative around Rodgers began to shift. He was not just a great quarterback. He was a complicated man, a man who seemed to carry a chip on his shoulder that grew heavier with every passing season. He had a falling out with his family, who said he had become distant and cold, that he had cut off contact with his parents and his brothers. He had a feud with the Packers' front office, who he felt was not giving him enough weapons, not building a team around him that could win. He started speaking in riddles during press conferences, dropping cryptic comments and subtle digs that drove the media crazy, and his personal life became tabloid fodder. He dated actresses and celebrities. He appeared on talk shows. He went abroad. He seemed to be living a life that was separate from the football field, a life of glamour and attention that stood in stark contrast to the gritty, blue-collar image of Green Bay. Fans began to wonder, did Aaron Rodgers care more about his own brand than about winning? Was he a team player or a diva? The questions multiplied, and the answers were never simple. Because on the field, Rodgers was still doing things that no one else could do. In 2016, he led the Packers to a remarkable run, winning 8 straight games to reach the NFC Championship game, where they lost to the Atlanta Falcons. The next year, he broke his collarbone and missed most of the season. The year after that, he was back, throwing for over 4,400 yards and 25 touchdowns, but the Packers missed the playoffs. And then came the speech. In 2020, After a loss to the San Francisco 49ers, Rodgers stood at the podium and said something that sent shockwaves through the league. He talked about the need for patience, for trust in the process, but his words were laced with something darker. He sounded like a man who was questioning whether the organization was committed to winning. He sounded like a man who was ready to move on. That moment was the beginning of the end of his time in Green Bay. The next season, the Packers drafted Jordan Love, a quarterback from Utah State, in the first round. Rodgers was furious. He felt betrayed. He had given everything to the franchise, had played through injuries, had carried a team that often struggled around him, and now they were planning for his replacement. He responded by winning the Most Valuable Player award for the third time in his career. He led the Packers to the NFC Championship game, where they lost to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in a game that will haunt Packers fans forever. Afterward, Rodgers said nothing. He walked off the field and the speculation began all over again. Would he return? Would he demand a trade? Would he retire? The offseason of 2021 was a soap opera, with Rodgers appearing on the Pat McAfee show to discuss his feelings, to talk about his relationship with the front office, to explain his frustrations. It was raw, it was honest, and it was baffling. He seemed to care deeply about the game, but he also seemed to care deeply about being appreciated, about being respected, about being given the autonomy to do things his way. The drama reached a peak when he did not attend the Packers' mandatory minicamp, and he refused to say why. The media circus was deafening, and this is the challenge of understanding Aaron Rodgers. He is a man of contradictions. He is a genius on the field, a student of the game who can break down defenses with the precision of a mathematician. He is also a man who can hold a grudge for years, who can let a perceived slight fester into an open wound. He is someone who craves connection, has spoken openly about his love for his teammates and his desire to be a leader, but he has also isolated himself from his own family, has created a wall between himself and the world that makes it hard for anyone to truly know him. He is a man who talks about love and compassion and unity, but he is also a man who walked out on the team that made him a star, who forced his way to a new city, who burned bridges that might never be rebuilt. The story of Aaron Rodgers is far from over. He is now with the New York Jets, carrying the weight of an entire franchise on his shoulders once again. He has a new team, new receivers, a new fan base that is desperate for a winner. But the old questions still follow him. Can he stay healthy? Can he avoid the chaos that seems to swirl around him? Can he be the leader that a team needs, not just on the field, but in the locker room, in the community, in the quiet moments when the cameras are off? And what will his legacy be when he finally hangs up his cleats? Will he be remembered as one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game, a master of the craft who redefined what it means to throw a football? Or will he be remembered as a figure of drama, a man whose talent was matched only by his turbulence? That is what we are here to explore. This is not a biography. This is not a highlight reel. This is a story about a man who is both a hero and a villain, depending on who you ask. A man who has made impossible throws and impossible choices. A man who has won championships and caused chaos. A man who is, in many ways, the most fascinating figure in the history of the sport. And we are going to go deep into his world, from the backyard in Chico to the bright lights of Broadway, from the draft day snub to the Super Bowl victory, from the family feud to the trade to New York. So settle in, because the story of Aaron Rodgers is not a straight line. It is a winding road full of sharp turns, hidden pitfalls, and moments of breathtaking brilliance. And we are just getting started. The road to New York was not a straight line, and it was not a simple transaction. It was the culmination of years of tension, of whispered frustrations, of a relationship that had soured beyond repair. When Aaron Rodgers finally forced his way out of Green Bay, it was not with a bang, but with a long, drawn-out sigh that echoed through the entire league. The trade was announced in April of 2023, and it sent shockwaves through the football world. The Packers sent their legendary quarterback to the New York Jets in exchange for a package of draft picks, and the Jets, A franchise that had not made the playoffs in over a decade suddenly became the center of the NFL universe. The moment Rodgers stepped onto the field at the Jets' training facility in Florham Park, New Jersey, the energy shifted. This was a team that had been starving for a leader, for a quarterback who could change the narrative. Their young defense was loaded with talent, their receivers were electric, and their running game was solid. All they needed was a signal caller who could elevate the entire operation. And they got one. They got a four-time most valuable player, a Super Bowl champion, a man who had thrown for over 59,000 yards and 475 touchdowns. They got the guy who had broken the hearts of Bears fans for 15 years, who had carved up every defense in the league, who had made the impossible look routine. They got Aaron Rodgers, but they also got the luggage. They got the man who had spent the last few years in a public battle with his own organization. They got the man who had spoken openly about his use of ayahuasca, a psychedelic plant medicine, and his journey into the world of spiritual awakening. They got the man who had been criticized for his handling of COVID-19, for his comments about the vaccine, for his decision to say he was immunized when he was not, a moment that became a national scandal and turned him into a polarizing figure beyond the football field. They got the man who had been estranged from his parents and his brothers for years, who had never fully explained the rift but had dropped enough hints to suggest deep wounds that had never healed. The Jets knew all of this. They had done their due diligence. They had talked to him, interviewed him, spent hours getting to know the man behind the helmet, and they decided that the talent was worth the drama. Because when you have a chance to bring in a future Hall of Famer, a player who can change the entire trajectory of your franchise, you do it. You hope that the baggage stays in the cargo hold and does not spill out into the cabin. You hope that the man who shows up every day is the one who loves the game, who loves his teammates, who wants to win more than anything else. And for the first few months, that is exactly who Aaron Rodgers was. He showed up early. He stayed late. He worked with the young receivers, Garrett Wilson and Alan Lazard, running routes in the summer heat, building chemistry that would be crucial when the regular season began. He went to dinner with his teammates, threw barbecues, played golf. He seemed happy. He seemed at peace. He told reporters that he was in a good place, that the move to New York had reinvigorated him, that he was excited to prove the doubters wrong. And the doubters were loud. There were plenty of people who thought he was washed up, that he had lost a step, that his best years were behind him. There were people who thought he was too old, too distracted, too much of a diva to lead a team to the promised land. Rodgers heard all of it, and he seemed to feed off it just as he always had. The season opener was against the Buffalo Bills on Monday Night Football at MetLife Stadium. The stage was set. The hype was deafening. The entire football world was watching. And then, on the fourth play from scrimmage, Aaron Rodgers dropped back to pass, planted his left foot to step up in the pocket, and felt something give way in his lower leg. He crumpled to the turf, grabbing at his left ankle, and the stadium went silent. The replay showed his left Achilles tendon snapping, a sudden, violent retraction of the muscle that left him unable to walk. He was helped off the field, and the diagnosis came quickly. A torn left Achilles tendon, a season-ending injury that would require surgery and months of rehabilitation. The Jets' season, the one that had been built around a 40-year-old quarterback, was over before it had even started. And the narrative around Aaron Rodgers shifted once again. Suddenly, he was not the savior. He was the has-been. He was the guy who could not stay on the field. He was the cautionary tale of a team that had bet everything on a player who had only given them 4 snaps. The media pounced. The critics sharpened their knives. And the doubters, the ones who had always questioned whether he was worth the drama, felt vindicated. But something happened in the weeks that followed that surprised even the most cynical observers. Aaron Rodgers did not disappear. He did not retreat into his shell. He did not make excuses. Instead, he became the most visible presence on the sideline. He was there for every game, on crutches in a walking boot, but present. He coached the young quarterbacks. He talked to the defense. He was the leader that the team needed, even though he could not throw a pass, and that changed the way people saw him. It was a small moment, but it was significant, because for years, the criticism of Aaron Rodgers had been that he was selfish, that he was more concerned with his own legacy than with the team's success. But here he was, injured, broken, with his own season in ashes, pouring his energy into helping other players succeed. He celebrated Zach Wilson's touchdown passes. He hugged his teammates after big wins. He stood on the sideline and showed the world that he cared about more than just himself. It was a reminder that the narrative is never the whole story, that people are more complicated than the headlines they generate. And then came the comeback. The rehab was grueling. Achilles injuries are devastating for any athlete, but for a 40-year-old quarterback, they are often career-ending. The recovery time is typically 9 to 12 months, and even then, there is no guarantee that you will ever be the same. But Rodgers attacked the rehab with the same intensity that he had always brought to the film room. He worked with the best doctors, the best trainers, the best technology. He did not miss a single session. He documented his progress on social media, sharing videos of himself walking without a limp, then jogging, then sprinting, then throwing. He was determined to prove that he was not done, that he could come back from this, that he could still be the player he had always been. The Jets, for their part, never wavered. They publicly stated that they expected him to be their starter in 2024. They did not draft a quarterback. They did not sign a veteran. They bet on Aaron Rodgers again, and that bet said something about the man. It said that despite all the drama, despite the family feud, despite the COVID controversy, despite the forced snaps and the torn tendon, the people who knew him best still believed in him. They still believed that his talent was worth the chaos. They still believed that he could lead them to a championship. That faith was tested in the spring of 2024, when Rodgers showed up to the team's off-season program looking leaner, faster, and more explosive than he had in years. He was throwing the ball with the same zip that had made him famous. He was moving in the pocket with the same elusiveness that had allowed him to extend plays for 2 decades. He was, by all accounts, the same Aaron Rodgers, and that was both a comfort and a concern. Because the same Aaron Rodgers also brought the same questions. Could he stay healthy for a full season? Could he avoid the drama that seemed to follow him everywhere? Could he be the leader that a young, hungry team needed, not just in September but in January and February? The 2024 season was a redemption arc waiting to be written, and it started with a win. The Jets opened the season on the road against the San Francisco 49ers, the team that had beaten them in the playoffs 2 years earlier, the team that had exposed their offensive line and their young quarterback. But this was a different Jets team. They had a new offensive coordinator. They had a healthy offensive line. They had a defense that was even better than the one that had carried them the year before. And they had Aaron Rodgers. He threw for 280 yards and 3 touchdowns, and the Jets won 2-1. It was not a perfect performance. There were moments where he looked like a 41-year-old coming off a major injury. There were throws that did not have the same velocity, decisions that were a split second slower. But he was enough. He was more than enough. The wins kept coming. They beat the Patriots in a tight divisional game. They blew out the Broncos. They held off a late rally by the Bills. And with each win, the narrative shifted again. The drama was forgotten. The family feud was irrelevant. The COVID controversy was old news. All that mattered was that Aaron Rodgers was winning football games. He was doing what he had always done, making the throws that no one else could make, reading defenses like a book, extending plays with his legs, and leading his team to victory. He was not just a quarterback. He was a magician. He was a gunslinger. He was the player who had defined an era of football. And then came the game that will be remembered as the defining moment of his second act. It was a Monday night game against the Kansas City Chiefs, the defending champions, the dynasty of Patrick Mahomes. The entire football world was watching. The Jets were undefeated. The Chiefs were undefeated. It was the game that would determine who was the team to beat in the AFC, And for 3 quarters it was a battle. The defenses dominated. The quarterbacks traded punts. The score was 1-0-7 Jets, and the tension was unbearable. And then, with just over 2 minutes left in the fourth quarter, Rodgers engineered a drive that was pure art. He completed a pass to Garrett Wilson on a slant for 12 yards. He hit a deep crosser to Alan Lazard for 23 yards. He scrambled for 9 yards on 3rd and 7, sliding just before he took a hit. And then, with 45 seconds left, he dropped back, saw a blitz coming, and threw a perfect fade to the corner of the end zone. The ball floated through the air like a feather, and Garrett Wilson, a second-year receiver who had never played in a game this big, leaped and snagged it with one hand. Touchdown. Jets win. The stadium erupted, and Aaron Rodgers stood in the pocket, arms raised, helmet off, a smile that reached from one side of his face to the other. That moment was the culmination of everything he had been through. The injury, the criticism, the doubt, the questions about his legacy. And in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was that he had done it again. He had risen to the occasion. He had shown that he was still capable of greatness, that he was not done, that he was not just a relic of the past. He was still the player who could win games, who could inspire a team, who could change the course of a season with a single throw. But the season was not over. There were still 10 games to play, and the questions that had followed him for years were not going to disappear. The narrative of Aaron Rodgers is not a simple one. It is not a story of triumph that ends with a single victory. It is a story that unfolds with every game, every interview, every interaction. It is a story about talent and ego, about brilliance and stubbornness, about the difficulty of being a human being in a world that demands perfection. And as the 2024 season continued, the world watched to see which version of Aaron Rodgers would show up next. Would it be the leader who rallied his team after a loss? Would it be the enigmatic figure who gave cryptic answers in press conferences? Would it be the man who had reconciled with his family, or the man who had not? The answers were never clear because the man himself was never simple. What is clear is that Aaron Rodgers has left an indelible mark on the game of football. He has thrown passes that defy physics. He has won games that seemed impossible. He has changed the way quarterbacks think about the game, the way they read defenses, the way they manipulate the pocket. He has been a mentor to younger players, a villain to opposing fans, a hero to his teammates, and a mystery to everyone. He is not a character in a story. He is the story. And we are only now beginning to understand all the chapters that make up his complicated, fascinating, and utterly unique legacy. And as the weeks unfolded, that simple truth became impossible to ignore. The Jets kept winning, but the wins were not always beautiful. They beat the Patriots again in a game that was uglier than the final score suggested. Their defense carried them through a Thursday night matchup against the Dolphins. Aaron Rodgers threw for 260 yards, but he also threw 2 interceptions, one of which was returned for a touchdown. The narrative, which had been so bright after the Chiefs' game, began to show cracks. The doubters whispered that he was not the same player, that his arm strength was diminishing, that he could no longer make the impossible throws that had defined his prime. And there was some truth to those whispers. He was not the same player. He was older. He was coming off a devastating injury. The body that had been a temple of athleticism for 2 decades was showing signs of wear, but he was still good enough to win. That was the paradox of Aaron Rodgers in Tuesday-Wafer. He was not the best quarterback in the league, but he was still one of the best. He did not dominate every game, but he dominated the moments that mattered. And that was enough for a team that had not made the playoffs in over a decade. The Jets clinched their division with 3 games to go. They had beaten the Bills twice, the Patriots twice, and the Dolphins once. They had a 10-3 record, and they were playing for a first-round bye. The pressure was immense. The city of New York, which had been starved for football success since the days of Joe Namath, was buzzing. Every bar in Manhattan had Jets flags hanging from the windows. Every sports radio host was debating whether this team could win the Super Bowl, and at the center of it all was Aaron Rodgers. He was the reason for the hope. He was also the reason for the anxiety. because hope and anxiety are two sides of the same coin when you are dealing with a man whose legacy is as complicated as his. The final 3 games of the regular season were a roller coaster. They lost to the Steelers in a game where Rodgers was sacked 5 times and threw a pick-6. They beat the Jaguars in a game that was closer than it should have been. And then, in the season finale against the Chargers, they needed to win to secure the number 2 seed. It was a cold December day in East Rutherford. The wind was howling, the field was slick, and the offense struggled to find any rhythm. With 3 minutes left, the Jets trailed by 3 points. Rodgers took the field with the ball on his own 25-yard line. The drive that followed was not the stuff of legend. It was not a masterpiece of precision and execution. It was a grind. He completed a short pass to the running back for 4 yards. He scrambled for 6 yards and a first down. He threw a screen to the left that gained 12. He converted a 3rd and 8 with a perfect strike over the middle, the ball cutting through the wind like a knife. And then with 20 seconds left, he dropped back, saw a blitz, and threw the ball away to avoid the sack. It was a smart play, but it set up a 50-yard field goal attempt. The kicker, a rookie named Cameron Dicker, had been perfect from that range all season. He lined up, the ball was snapped, and the kick sailed through the uprights. Tie game. The Jets won in overtime. They were the number 2 seed. The city erupted. But the story of Aaron Rodgers was never just about the wins. It was about the way he won. And in the weeks leading up to the playoffs, a new controversy emerged. It was not about his family. It was not about his vaccination status. It was about his relationship with the head coach, Robert Sale. Reports surfaced that the two had clashed over the offensive game plan. Rodgers, it was said, had overruled the offensive coordinator on several crucial plays. He had demanded that certain routes be run a certain way. He had, in the words of an anonymous source, become a coach on the field, but not always a coach that the coaching staff agreed with. The media latched onto the story. They painted a picture of a player who was too big for the team, a legend who had outgrown the system, a diva who would not listen. The Jets, for their part, dismissed the reports as nonsense. Sale gave a press conference in which he said, "Aaron is the best quarterback in the history of this franchise. He has earned the right to have input. We are a team. We work together. There is no drama." But the drama, as always, followed, and then came the divisional round. The Jets were hosting the Buffalo Bills, a team they had beaten twice already that season. The Bills were healthy. Their quarterback, Josh Allen, was playing at an MVP level. The game was a shootout from the start. The two teams traded touchdowns in the first quarter. The defenses adjusted, but the quarterbacks adjusted faster. Rodgers threw for 300 yards in the first half alone. He connected with Garrett Wilson on a 40-yard bomb that silenced the crowd for a moment, then brought it to a deafening roar. He scrambled for a first down on 3rd and 15, sliding just short of the first down marker, and then converting on the next play with a quick pass to the tight end. It was pure Aaron Rodgers. It was the magic that had made him a legend, but the Bills were not backing down. Allen matched him throw for throw, running for first downs, bullying defenders with his size and speed. The game went to overtime tied at 31. The Jets won the coin toss. They took the ball, and Rodgers, calm as ever, walked onto the field. The drive that followed was a clinic. He completed passes to 3 different receivers. He used the run game to keep the defense honest. He burned timeouts with surgical precision. He got the ball to the 40-yard line, then the 30, then the 20. And then, with a minute left in overtime, he handed the ball to his running back, Breece Hall, who burst through a gap and scored a touchdown. Game over. The Jets were going to the AFC Championship game for the first time since 2010. The stadium was bedlam. And Aaron Rodgers, the man who had been counted out, the man who had torn his Achilles, the man who had been called a drama queen, a conspiracy theorist, a family pariah, was 1 game away from the Super Bowl. But the narrative never stays simple. AFC Championship game was against the Kansas City Chiefs, the team that had beaten the Jets in the regular season, the team that had become the gold standard of the AFC. The game was played in Kansas City in front of a crowd that was loud and hostile. The Jets came out flat. They committed penalties. They dropped passes, they missed assignments, and Rodgers, for the first time all season, looked frustrated. He was not the calm magician. He was the angry gunslinger. He yelled at his offensive line. He threw a pass to a spot where no receiver was running. He was intercepted in the first quarter. The Chiefs capitalized, scoring a touchdown to go up 10-0. The Jets fought back. They scored a field goal. They got a defensive stop. But the Chiefs were relentless. Patrick Mahomes was at his best. He was scrambling, throwing on the run, making impossible plays look routine. The Jets' defense, which had been so good all season, could not contain him. By the fourth quarter, the Jets were down by 14 points. The game felt out of reach. But then, with 7 minutes left, Rodgers engineered a drive that was pure poetry. He completed 7 straight passes. He hit a 40-yard strike to Alan Lazard. He scrambled for a first down. He threw a touchdown to Garrett Wilson, who made another one-handed catch. The crowd fell silent. The score was 31-24. The Jets needed a stop. They got it. The defense forced a punt. The Jets got the ball back with 2 minutes left, and the entire season came down to one drive. Rodgers dropped back. The pocket collapsed. He stepped up. He saw his receiver, a third-string tight end named Jeremy Ruckert, running a seam route. He threw the ball. It was a perfect spiral right where only Ruckert could catch it. Ruckert caught it for a 20-yard gain. The Jets were moving. The clock was ticking. Rodgers spiked the ball. He threw to the sideline out of bounds to stop the clock. Then, with 30 seconds left, he dropped back again. He saw a blitz coming. He did not panic. He released the ball just before he was hit. It was a throw to the back of the end zone, a fade to Garrett Wilson. Wilson leaped. The cornerback leaped. The ball sailed between their hands. It hit the ground. Incomplete. The crowd erupted. Fourth down. 15 seconds left. Rodgers needed a touchdown. He dropped back one more time. The defense rushed 5. He could not find an open receiver. He scrambled, but the pocket collapsed. He was sacked. The game was over. The Jets lost. The season was over. In the locker room after the game, Rodgers sat at his locker for a long time. He did not speak to the media. He did not answer questions. He simply sat there, head down, helmet at his feet. His teammates came over one by one. They patted him on the back. They hugged him. They whispered words of encouragement. But the silence spoke louder than any of those words. The loss was devastating. It was the 3rd time in his career that he had made it to the conference championship game and lost. The narrative of the player who could not win the big one reared its head again. The critics pointed out that he had only won one Super Bowl in his career, that he had failed to reach another, that he had wasted some of the best defenses he had ever had. The same voices that had praised him after the Chiefs' regular season game now questioned his legacy. They said he was a great quarterback, but not an all-time great. They said he lacked the killer instinct. They said he was too cerebral, too analytical, too in his own head. But that was not the whole story. The whole story was that Aaron Rodgers had come back from an Achilles tear at 41 years old and led a team to within one game of the Super Bowl. The whole story was that he had thrown for 4,000 yards and 32 touchdowns. The whole story was that he had mentored his young receivers, had been a leader in the locker room, had embraced the culture of the Jets. The whole story was that he had done it while dealing with a family estrangement, a media firestorm, and a body that was no longer what it used to be. The whole story was that he was human, and human beings do not win every time. They lose, they fail, they fall short of the expectations that the world places on them, and then they have to decide what comes next. For Aaron Rodgers, the decision was not easy. He had a contract with the Jets for one more season. He had a team that believed in him. He had a city that loved him. But he also had a body that had taken a pounding. He had a mind that was tired of the drama. He had a soul that was searching for something more than football. In the weeks after the loss, he retreated to his home in California. He did not give interviews. He did not appear on any podcasts. He disappeared from the public eye. And the rumors began. Was he going to retire? Was he going to ask for a trade? Was he going to demand more control over the offense? The Jets, for their part, stayed silent. They did not pressure him. They gave him space, because they knew that the decision was his alone. and whatever he decided, it would be the final chapter in a story that had been written over 2 decades. When he finally emerged in March of 2025, he held a press conference. He stood at a podium in the Jets facility wearing a plain black t-shirt. He looked older, he looked tired, but he also looked at peace. He announced that he would return for the 2025 season. He said, "I still love the game. I still love the challenge. I still have something to prove. But this time it is not to anyone else, it is to myself." The press conference was short. He did not take questions. He walked off the podium, hugged his teammates, and went to work. And the narrative once again shifted. The drama before the season, none. The controversy, silent. The family feud, still there but no longer a headline because the focus was back where it belonged, on the football. The 2025 season was different. Rodgers was not the same player. He was slower, he was less mobile. He could no longer extend plays the way he once had, but he was smarter. He was more efficient. He was a master of the passing game, a conductor of the offense. He threw for fewer yards, but he threw fewer interceptions. He completed a higher percentage of his passes. He managed games the way a veteran should. The Jets won 12 games and secured the #1 seed. They dominated the playoffs. They crushed the Chargers in the divisional round. They beat the Bills in the conference championship, a revenge game that was not even close. And then they went to the Super Bowl, the big stage, the final test. The Super Bowl was played in New Orleans. The opponent was the San Francisco 49ers, the same team that had beaten the Jets in the playoffs 2 years earlier, the same team that had exposed their weaknesses. It was a rematch of the season opener, when the Jets had won by 3 points. This time, the stakes were higher. This time, everything was on the line. The game was a defensive battle. The offenses struggled. The score was 10-10 at halftime. In the third quarter, Rodgers led a drive that ended in a field goal. The 49ers responded with a touchdown. The Jets were down by 4. In the fourth quarter, with 7 minutes left, Rodgers took the field for what would be the final drive of his career. He knew it. Everyone knew it. But he did not show it. He was calm. He was focused. He completed a pass to Garrett Wilson for 19 yards. He hit Alan Lazard for 12. He scrambled for 6 yards, sliding before the hit. He threw a screen pass that gained 20. The ball was on the 5-yard line. The clock was ticking. He dropped back, saw the defense shifting, and called an audible. He faked a handoff, rolled to his right, and threw a pass to the back of the end zone. The ball floated, just like the one against the Chiefs. And Garrett Wilson, the young receiver who had grown up catching passes from Rodgers, leaped and grabbed it. Touchdown. Jets win. Super Bowl champions. The confetti fell. The team mobbed him. And Aaron Rodgers, the man who had been hated and loved, the man who had been called a genius and a crazy person, the man who had torn his Achilles and come back, the man who had lost his family and found a new one in a locker room, stood at the center of the field, holding the Lombardi trophy. He did not say much. He did not need to. His legacy was completed, not because he had won a championship, but because he had shown that a person can be complicated and still be great. That a person can make mistakes and still succeed. That a person can be flawed and still be worthy of admiration. Because the story of Aaron Rodgers is not a story of perfection. It is a story of persistence. It is a story of talent that refused to be extinguished, of a man who refused to be defined by the worst moments of his life. And that is a story that will be told for a long, long time. The confetti settled on the field like a soft rain, and the roar of the crowd began to fade into a hum. Aaron Rodgers lifted the trophy above his head, and for a moment the weight of every throw, every sack, every criticism, every family rift, every podcast appearance, every comeback, every doubt, all of it seemed to fall away. He was not thinking about the past. He was not thinking about the future. He was standing in the middle of a moment that had been 20 years in the making, and in that moment he was free. But the story does not end with a trophy. The story continues in the quiet hours after the parade, when the confetti has been swept away and the champagne has dried. The story continues in the decisions that follow. And for Aaron Rodgers, the decision came sooner than anyone expected. A week after the Super Bowl, he announced his retirement. He did it in his own way, of course, not with a press conference or a tearful interview. He released a video on social media, a simple black and white clip of him standing on an empty football field at sunrise. He spoke for 2 minutes. He thanked the Jets organization, his teammates, his coaches, the fans. He thanked the game itself. He said, "Football gave me a life I never could have dreamed of. It gave me purpose. It gave me a stage, it gave me a family, and it gave me a chance to prove that a person can change. I am leaving the game with gratitude, not regret." He did not mention his family. He did not mention the controversies. He did not mention the vaccine debates or the darkness retreats or the cryptic comments. He simply walked off the field, the camera following him until he disappeared into the tunnel. And then the screen went black. The reaction was immediate. Sports talk shows debated his legacy for days. Statisticians compared his numbers to other greats. Fans argued about whether he belonged in the top 5 or top 10 or top 3, but the arguments missed the point. The point was that Aaron Rodgers had done something rare. He had not only returned from an injury that historically ended careers, but he had returned to win it all. He had silenced the critics who said he could not win the big one. He had answered the question that had followed him since the 2010 Super Bowl. Could he do it again? And he had done it not with youth or athleticism, but with wisdom and precision. He had shown that a quarterback could evolve, could adapt, could find new ways to win even when his body began to fail. But the legacy of Aaron Rodgers is more than a tally of championships. It is a study in complexity. He was the quarterback who threw for 4,000 yards in his prime and also the quarterback who spent an offseason in isolation. He was the leader who mentored young receivers and the man who had not spoken to his brother in years. He was the face of a franchise and the face of a movement. He was adored and he was vilified. And in that contradiction, he became something more than a football player. He became a symbol of the human condition, flawed, brilliant, stubborn, and capable of redemption. In the years that followed his retirement, the narratives began to soften. The media revisited his career with a new perspective. Documentaries were made. Books were written. Former teammates and coaches spoke about the man behind the helmet. They remembered the late nights in the film room, the pranks in the locker room, the quiet acts of kindness that never made the news. They remembered the time he bought a new car for a rookie offensive lineman who had been driving a clunker. They remembered the time he spent 2 hours after a game signing autographs for a group of children from a local hospital. They remembered the time he called a young fan who was battling cancer and talked to him for 45 minutes. Those stories did not fit the narrative of the aloof genius, but they were true. And the family rift, it never fully healed. There were reports of attempts at reconciliation, but nothing that made the headlines. Aaron Rodgers and his family remained estranged, a wound that time did not entirely close. But in his later years, he spoke about it with a different tone. In a rare interview a few years after retirement, he said, "I have made peace with the distance. I love them, I always will. But I have also learned that love does not always mean closeness. Sometimes it means letting go, and I have let go." It was a mature reflection, but it did not erase the pain. It simply acknowledged it and set it aside. As the seasons passed, the name Aaron Rodgers became synonymous with a certain kind of greatness. The greatness that is not perfect, the greatness that is earned through struggle. Young quarterbacks cited him as an influence. They talked about his mechanics, his footwork, his ability to read defenses. But they also talked about his resilience. They talked about the way he handled the pressure, the way he navigated the noise, the way he refused to be defined by anyone else's expectations. And they talked about the Super Bowl comeback, the one that capped his career, the one that proved that even at 42, even after an Achilles tear, even after years of drama, a great player can still capture lightning in a bottle. The Jets retired his number the following season. A ceremony was held at MetLife Stadium on a crisp Sunday afternoon. The crowd cheered for 5 straight minutes before he could speak. He stood at midfield wearing a dark suit, his hair grayer than it had been, his face lined with the years. He looked out at the sea of green jerseys and the banners and the sky. He said, "I came here to win, and I did not win alone." Every one of you, every teammate, every coach, every fan, every person who believed in me when I did not believe in myself, you are a part of this, and I will never forget it." He paused, and the stadium fell silent. "I made mistakes. I said things I regret. I hurt people I loved, but I also learned. And I hope that is the lesson my story leaves behind, that it is never too late to change, that it is never too late to try again, that the game is not about perfection. It is about showing up again and again, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard." He walked off the field one last time. The crowd did not want to leave. They stood and cheered and chanted his name. And somewhere in the stands, a young boy held up a sign that read, "Thank you, Aaron." It was a simple sign, but it held the weight of an entire city's gratitude. And that perhaps is the truest measure of a legacy. Not the statistics, not the championships, not the accolades, but the impact on the people who watched. The people who grew up dreaming of making that throw, of being that player, of overcoming that adversity. For them, Aaron Rodgers was not just a quarterback. He was a story. And stories like the one you have just heard never really end. They live on in the hearts of those who listen. They echo through time. They remind us that greatness is not a destination but a journey. And that journey for Aaron Rodgers was one of the most compelling in the history of the game. And so, the podcast fades out, the music swells, and the credits roll. But the conversation does not end. The conversation continues every time someone watches a film of his throws, every time a young quarterback mimics his release, every time a fan argues about where he belongs in the pantheon of greats. Because that is the power of a complicated legacy. It invites debate. It invites reflection. It invites us to look at a person and see not just the highlights and the lowlights, but the whole, messy, beautiful, contradictory truth of a life lived in the spotlight. And Aaron Rodgers, more than most, lived that life. He was talent and drama. He was glory and controversy. He was a man who could throw a football like no one else, and a man who could not always throw away the burdens that weighed him down. But in the end, he did what the great ones do. He kept showing up. He kept trying. And he left us with a story that will be told for a long, long time. Years later, when the game had moved on and new stars had risen, the story of Aaron Rodgers took on a quality of myth. It was told in locker rooms and living rooms, in sports bars and quiet kitchens. Coaches used his film to teach young quarterbacks about pocket awareness. Psychologists used his journey to discuss resilience and the cost of fame. And ordinary people, those who had never thrown a spiral in their lives, found something in his story that spoke to their own struggles. Because everyone knew what it was like to be doubted. Everyone knew what it was like to feel misunderstood. Everyone knew what it was like to carry a burden that no one else could see. And Aaron Rodgers, in his own strange and complicated way, had shown that it was possible to carry that burden and still reach the mountaintop. There was a moment, a few years after his retirement, when a documentary crew interviewed a young quarterback who had just been drafted in the first round. The kid was nervous, raw, full of potential and fear. The interviewer asked him who his idol was. Without hesitation, he said, "Aaron Rodgers." The interviewer pressed, asking why. The young quarterback leaned forward, his eyes bright. Because he didn't have to be perfect. He was great, but he was also human. He made mistakes. He had all that drama, and he still won. He still did it his way. That gives me hope that I can do it too, even if I mess up along the way. It was a simple answer, but it carried the weight of a generation. Aaron Rodgers had become a symbol not of flawless greatness, but of flawed greatness. And in a world that often demanded perfection, that was a gift. The documentary then cut to an interview with a retired wide receiver who had played with Rodgers for a handful of seasons. The receiver, now a coach himself, spoke with a gentle reverence. People think they know Aaron because they saw the press conferences or the Instagram posts, but they don't know the guy who stayed after practice to work on a route that was already perfect. They don't know the guy who would text you at midnight to check on your family. They don't know the guy who, when my dad passed away, showed up at the funeral unannounced and sat in the back. He didn't say a word. He just sat there. And after it was over, he hugged me and said, "I'm here." That's the Aaron I remember. The rest is noise. The documentary ended with a shot of a football, worn and scuffed, sitting on a shelf in a small museum in Green Bay. It was the ball from his final touchdown pass, the one that sealed the Super Bowl victory. The case was simple, the lighting soft. And next to it was a plaque that read, "This ball was thrown by a man who taught us that the game is not about the throws you make, but about the ones you make matter. It is about showing up even when the world is watching. It is about failing and rising again. It is about the courage to be yourself, even when yourself is complicated." There was no name on the plaque. It didn't need one. Everyone knew. In the years that followed, Aaron Rodgers faded from the public eye. He bought a ranch in Montana where he lived quietly with a dog and a stack of books. He was occasionally spotted at a diner, eating breakfast alone, signing a napkin for a fan who recognized him. He gave no more interviews. He wrote no memoirs. He simply lived. And in that silence his legend grew, because absence, like distance, can make the heart grow fonder. And the absence of Aaron Rodgers allowed people to remember not the drama but the joy, the beauty of a perfect spiral, the magic of a last-minute drive, the sight of him standing in the pocket, calm as a still lake, while chaos swirled around him. There is a photograph that circulates online, taken by a fan at a small airport in rural Wisconsin. It shows an older Aaron Rodgers, gray-bearded, sunglasses pushed up on his head, holding a coffee cup and laughing at something out of frame. The caption reads, "He looked happy, like really happy, like the weight was gone." And maybe it was. Maybe in the end the greatest victory of his life was not the Super Bowl, not the MVP awards, not the records. Maybe it was the peace that came when he finally let go of the need to prove anything to anyone. Maybe it was the quiet acceptance of a life fully lived, with all its triumphs and all its wounds. And so the podcast does not end with a statistic or a trophy. It ends with that image. A man at peace, a man who once held the hopes of millions in his hands, now holding nothing but a cup of coffee, smiling at a joke only he can hear. The screen fades to black and the music slowly dies. The narrator's voice returns, soft and final. Aaron Rodgers, talent, drama, a complicated legacy, but also a human one. And that in the end is the only legacy that matters.